My mother-in-law replaced all my photos in their family home with pictures of my husband's ex-girlfriend. She'd introduced the ex as the daughter I should have had at gatherings. When she gave my engagement ring to the ex at Christmas dinner, I congratulated them both graciously. Her next family announcement would be far less celebratory. The sound of my engagement ring hitting the mahogany table was barely audible over the Christmas music playing softly in the background, but to me it rang like a gunshot. My mother-in-law's manicured fingers pushed the diamond solitaire across the polished surface with deliberate precision, sliding it directly into the outstretched palm of my husband's ex-girlfriend like she was passing a communion wafer. "This belongs with someone who truly appreciates family," she announced, her voice carrying that saccharine tone she reserved for moments when she wanted to appear generous while delivering a knife to the heart. "Before we continue with this story of quiet revenge, I want to thank you for being here with me. If you believe that women deserve respect in their families and shouldn't have to endure betrayal in silence, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to know they're not alone in these struggles. Now let's see how I turned their cruelty into my greatest strength." The dining room, usually filled with the comfortable chatter of post-Christmas dinner conversation, fell into a silence so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Uncle Robert's fork froze halfway to his mouth, still laden with pumpkin pie. My sister-in-law Jennifer's eyes went wide behind her reading glasses, darting between me and the unfolding scene like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. Even the children, who had been arguing over the last dinner roll moments before, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere and fell quiet. But I had been expecting this moment for weeks. The signs had been building all evening like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. During appetizers, my mother-in-law had made a point of seating the ex-girlfriend, Sarah, in what used to be my traditional spot beside the Christmas tree. When we gathered for family photos before dinner, she had somehow maneuvered me to the very edge of the group while positioning Sarah front and center, her arm draped possessively around my husband's waist. Most telling of all was the way she kept glancing at me throughout the meal, waiting for some reaction, some sign that I was finally ready to break. "Congratulations," I said, my voice steady and warm as summer honey. "It's absolutely beautiful on you, Sarah. It looks like it was meant for your hand." The words came out so naturally, so genuinely pleased, that even I was impressed by my own performance. I had practiced this moment in my bathroom mirror for 3 weeks, perfecting the exact tone of gracious defeat that would satisfy my mother-in-law's need to see me crumble while protecting my own dignity. Sarah's face flushed pink as she slipped the ring onto her finger. My ring finger, the same finger that had worn it for 4 years of marriage. She looked genuinely surprised by my reaction, perhaps expecting tears or protests or at least some visible sign of distress. Instead, I smiled and raised my wine glass in a mock toast. "To new beginnings," I said, meeting each pair of eyes around the table. "And to family." Jennifer shot me a look that was equal parts admiration and concern. She knew me well enough to recognize that my calm acceptance was more dangerous than any tantrum could have been. Her husband David cleared his throat uncomfortably and mumbled something about checking on the game in the living room, eager to escape the mounting tension. My husband, my soon-to-be ex-husband, though he didn't know it yet, sat frozen in his chair like a deer caught in headlights. His mother had orchestrated this entire scene without consulting him, and I could see the panic beginning to creep into his features as he realized he was now complicit in something he hadn't explicitly agreed to. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, searching for words that wouldn't come. The ring had been missing from my jewelry box for 3 months. When I'd asked about it, he'd mumbled something about having it cleaned and resized, a story so obviously fabricated that I hadn't bothered to challenge it. Instead, I'd done what any reasonable person would do in the digital age. I'd tracked down the receipt and called the jeweler myself. The ring hadn't been cleaned or resized. It had been picked up by his mother in September, accompanied by a woman matching Sarah's description. That phone call had been my wake-up moment, the instant I stopped being a victim and started being a strategist. "The ring was getting too loose on my finger anyway," I continued conversationally, taking another sip of wine. "Funny how things change when you lose weight from stress, isn't it? But it fits you perfectly, Sarah. Like it was always meant to be yours." My mother-in-law's smile faltered slightly. She had expected resistance, maybe even a scene that would justify her actions and paint me as the unstable, emotional wife who couldn't handle her son's happiness. Instead, my gracious acceptance was throwing off her entire script. Sarah twisted the ring nervously, the diamonds catching the light from the chandelier above. I didn't know you hadn't. I mean, she said you'd given it back willingly. Oh, but I did, I replied smoothly, meeting my mother-in-law's eyes directly. In a way. Sometimes we give things up without realizing we're doing it. Sometimes we're so focused on keeping peace that we forget to fight for what's ours. The double meaning hung in the air like incense, sweet and suffocating. Around the table, family members began to find excuses to leave. The children drifted toward the living room and their new toys. The men gravitated toward the football game on television. The women started clearing dishes with unusual efficiency, suddenly desperate to have something to do with their hands. But I remained seated, calmly finishing my dessert while my world officially ended. You know what I love most about Christmas? I mused aloud, addressing no one in particular. It's how it brings out people's true nature. All the pretending stops and you finally see who everyone really is beneath the wrapping paper and good intentions. My mother-in-law's jaw tightened. She wasn't stupid, she could hear the steel beneath my silk, the warning wrapped in Christmas sentiment. Family is everything to me, she said, her voice taking on that self-righteous tone she used when she wanted to appear noble. And sometimes family means making difficult decisions for the greater good. Absolutely, I agreed, standing to help clear the table. Family means knowing who truly belongs and who's just visiting. It means understanding the difference between blood loyalty and earned respect. Most importantly, it means remembering that every action has consequences. As I stacked plates and gathered silverware, I could feel the weight of their stares. Sarah kept touching the ring like a talisman, perhaps beginning to understand that she hadn't won a prize so much as inherited a burden. My husband looked increasingly uncomfortable, finally realizing that his mother had just blown up his marriage without consulting him first. But it was my mother-in-law's expression that satisfied me most. For the first time in our relationship, I saw uncertainty flicker across her features. She had expected me to crumble, to storm out, to give her the dramatic exit that would justify her actions to the rest of the family. Instead, I was still here, still smiling, still playing the perfect daughter-in-law even as she handed my marriage to another woman. That uncertainty was the first crack in her armor, and I intended to widen it until the whole structure came tumbling down. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside my silent husband, I stared at the ceiling and felt something cold and calculating settle into place where my heart used to be. Not anger. Anger was hot and unpredictable and ultimately self-destructive. This was something far more dangerous. Absolute clarity about who these people really were and what they were capable of. They had been planning this for months, maybe years. Every family gathering where Sarah was mysteriously invited. Every conversation about what's best for everyone. Every photo quietly removed from the mantle and replaced with memories that didn't include me. They had been erasing me systematically, counting on my politeness and my desire to keep peace to smooth their path. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed that because I didn't fight back, I was weak. They confused kindness with naivety, grace with surrender. Tomorrow I would begin teaching them the difference. The ring was gone, but that was just the beginning. They wanted to play games with family loyalty and belonging. They wanted to see how far they could push before I broke. I smiled in the darkness, already planning my first move. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The phone sat in my hands for 30 minutes before I finally dialed her number. 2 weeks had passed since Christmas dinner, enough time for the initial shock to settle into something more useful, strategic thinking. I had spent those 14 days studying Sarah's social media profiles, learning her patterns, understanding what made her tick. Single mother, recently unemployed from a marketing firm, living in a cramped apartment with her 8-year-old daughter. Most importantly, increasingly dependent on my mother-in-law's financial support. Sarah. I let my voice crack slightly, just enough to suggest I'd been crying. It's me. I hope you don't mind me calling directly. The pause on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Oh. Hi. How did you get my number? From the family contact list, I replied, which was true. I've been thinking about Christmas dinner, about what happened. About how surprised you looked when she gave you the ring. Another pause. I could practically hear her mental wheels turning, trying to figure out if this was a trap. I want you to know I'm not angry with you, I continued, letting exhaustion seep into my voice. I think we're both being manipulated here, and I need someone who understands what it's like to deal with her. The shift in her breathing told me I'd hit the right note. You think she's manipulating me? Sarah, you've known her for how long? 6 years. 7. Has she ever, in all that time, done something that didn't somehow benefit her in the end? The silence stretched longer this time. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, more uncertain. She said you'd given the ring back willingly. That you understood it belonged with someone who really loved the family. Did that seem like something I'd do? I asked gently. Give up my engagement ring without a fight? Or did it seem like something she'd orchestrate to make herself look generous while getting rid of me? I could hear her shifting in her chair, maybe pacing. I mean, she's been so good to me and Emma. She pays for Emma's dance classes, helps with groceries when money's tight. And what does she ask for in return? I pressed. Your presence at every family gathering? Your agreement with everything she says? Your willingness to be the daughter she never had while I'm standing right there. The sharp intake of breath told me I'd struck home. Look, I said, softening my tone, I don't want to fight with you. We're both just trying to survive in her world. Maybe we could talk in person? Somewhere away from all the family drama, where we can be honest with each other. An hour later, I was driving 43 minutes out of town to a generic coffee chain where nobody would recognize either of us. I'd chosen the location carefully, far enough from familiar territory that Sarah would feel safe speaking freely, busy enough that our conversation would be lost in the ambient noise, but quiet enough that I could control the mood. She was already there when I arrived, hunched over a large latte with extra foam, picking at a blueberry muffin. Without makeup and designer clothes, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Tired. The kind of tired that comes from constantly worrying about money and trying to be perfect for people who hold your security in their hands. Thank you for coming, I said, sliding into the seat across from her. I know this is weird. It's definitely weird, she agreed, but her smile was genuine. I wasn't sure what to expect. I ordered my own coffee, a simple black coffee, nothing fancy, and let the silence settle between us while I studied her face. Up close, I could see the stress lines around her eyes, the way she kept checking her phone for messages from Emma's school or potential employers. Can I ask you something honestly? I said finally. When she handed you that ring, did you know she hadn't told me it was happening? Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. I suspected. But she made it sound like it was already decided, like you'd agreed to it as part of some kind of divorce settlement. We're not getting divorced, I said carefully. At least there's been no discussion of it. The ring just disappeared from my jewelry box 3 months ago. Her eyes widened. She told me you'd given it back because you realized it should go to someone who understood the family legacy. What family legacy? The money. The investments. She said there were family traditions about who inherits what, and that I needed to understand my place in all of it if I was going to be part of the family. I felt my pulse quicken. This was better than I'd hoped. What kind of investments? Sarah glanced around nervously as if someone might be listening. She mentioned that your father-in-law had set up some kind of trust fund before he died. Overseas accounts, property investments, that sort of thing. She said it was complicated, that there were tax reasons why it had to be kept quiet. I leaned back in my chair, letting surprise cross my features. She told you about the overseas accounts? You know about them? I only found out recently, I whispered, leaning forward conspiratorially. I was going through some of his old papers in the attic, looking for our wedding photos that she claimed were somewhere safe. I found bank statements, account numbers, investment portfolios. Sir, there's so much money. Way more than anyone realizes. Her eyes went sharp with interest. How much money? I pulled out my phone and showed her a carefully doctored screenshot. A bank statement I'd created using my basic design skills and a legitimate bank's formatting. The account balance showed $847,000 in a Cayman Islands account under my late father-in-law's name. This is just one account, I said quietly. There are 4 others that I found. She's been living off the interest for years, telling everyone that his pension and social security are barely covering her expenses. Sarah stared at the screen, her mouth slightly open. She's been crying poverty while sitting on almost $1 million? More than that. Much more. I put my phone away, letting the image burn into her memory. And she's been using it to control everyone. Your dance classes for Emma? Your grocery money? She could afford to set you up for life, but instead she gives you just enough to keep you grateful and dependent. That. Sarah's voice trailed off as pieces started falling into place in her mind. That manipulative witch. Now you see why I think we're both being used, I said gently. She pits us against each other, makes us compete for scraps of her attention and approval, while she hoards resources that should benefit the whole family. Sarah's hands were shaking slightly as she reached for her latte. Emma's been asking for a bike for months. A used one from the thrift store cost $60 and I told her we couldn't afford it. Meanwhile, she's been sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars. The worst part is she's probably planning to cut us both out entirely, I continued. Think about it, she gives you my ring, makes you feel special and chosen, but has she mentioned anything about including you in her will? Has she talked about Emma's college fund, or your future security? The look on Sarah's face told me everything I needed to know. We need to protect ourselves, I said firmly. Both of us. And Emma deserves better than this. 2 weeks later, Sarah called me from her lawyer's office. The legal papers had been filed that morning. A formal demand for her rightful share of the estate, backed by the documents I'd helped her discover, and the testimony of neighbors who'd witnessed years of her being treated like family. My mother-in-law's phone started ringing that afternoon and it didn't stop for days. The phone calls started that afternoon. Hysterical, rambling conversations where my mother-in-law demanded that anyone make sense of what was happening to her. Sarah's lawyer had delivered the inheritance papers personally, showing up at her front door with a briefcase full of legal documents and a smile that promised expensive complications. But I was already 3 steps ahead, having spent the past week researching every gift Sarah had given my mother-in-law over the past year. The Louis Vuitton handbag for Mother's Day. The Mikimoto pearl necklace for her birthday. The Hermes silk scarf she'd worn to church every Sunday since receiving it. Each piece had been carefully chosen, expensive enough to demonstrate devotion, classic enough to appeal to my mother-in-law's traditional tastes. My divorce attorney had mentioned a man named Marcus during our initial consultation, not as someone I'd need, but as a cautionary tale about what happened when custody battles got ugly. He specializes in creating evidence, she'd said with distaste. Fake texts, doctored photos, that sort of thing. I refuse to work with people like that, but he exists. It had taken me 2 days to track down Marcus through a chain of referrals that led from family lawyers to private investigators to the kinds of people who advertised discreet services on websites that looked like they belonged in the early 2000s. His office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation service, the kind of place you'd drive past without noticing. I need exact replicas of these items, I'd told him, spreading photos across his cluttered desk. But with modifications. Marcus was a thin man with nervous energy and ink-stained fingers who asked no questions about why someone would want replica designer goods that had been deliberately damaged. He quoted me a price that would have made me wince 6 months ago, but now felt like a worthwhile investment in psychological warfare. The modifications will take extra time, he'd warned. Especially if you want them to look authentic but disturbing. I want them to look like they were made by someone who loves her but has lost their mind, I'd replied. 3 weeks later, the first package arrived at my mother-in-law's house on a Tuesday morning when I knew she'd be alone. I'd been tracking her schedule through her social media posts and Jennifer's casual mentions of her activities. Yoga class on Mondays and Thursdays, grocery shopping on Wednesdays, bridge club on Fridays. Tuesdays were her hermit days, when she stayed home to clean and organize and generally prepare for the rest of the week. The Chanel bag looked perfect from a distance. Same quilted patterns, same gold chain, same leather texture. But Marcus had worked his magic in the details. The corners showed what appeared to be dried blood, dark brown stains that could have been anything but suggested something terrible. The interior smelled faintly of copper and decay, achieved through a combination of chemicals I didn't want to know about. The accompanying note was written in Sarah's distinctive handwriting, which I'd practiced for hours using samples from her legal documents and old birthday cards I'd found while helping clean out family storage boxes. You wanted me to be family, it read in blue ink that matched Sarah's preferred pen. Now you'll never forget me. I knew she'd received it when her first panicked phone call came that evening. Someone sent me something horrible, she told Jennifer, who immediately called me to relay the conversation. It looks like Sarah's bag, but it's been tampered with. There's something wrong with it. Maybe it's a manufacturing defect? Jennifer had suggested, playing her role perfectly without knowing she was part of my plan. No, this is deliberate. This is someone trying to scare me. The second package arrived the following Tuesday. The pearl necklace, now with several pearls replaced with what looked like human teeth. The dental work was convincing enough to pass casual inspection but disturbing enough to trigger deep unease. The clasp had been altered to leave marks on skin, tiny scratches that would heal but remain memorable. This time my mother-in-law didn't call Jennifer. She called the police. Officer Martinez was patient and professional when he responded to her complaint about threatening packages, but I could see the skepticism in his report when Jennifer showed it to me later. Without evidence of who was sending the packages, and with no explicit threats contained in the notes, there wasn't much the police could do beyond filing a report and suggesting she install security cameras. Has she been having any disputes with family members? Officer Martinez had asked, apparently unaware of the irony. Just the usual family drama, my mother-in-law had replied, probably not mentioning the inheritance lawsuit currently destroying her relationship with her chosen daughter. The third package was my masterpiece. The silk scarf had been rewoven with strands of Sarah's actual hair, collected during my reconnaissance visits to her salon. I'd posed as a potential client, complimenting the stylist's work on Sarah's color treatment while discreetly gathering the hair clippings that ended up in my purse. Marcus had somehow managed to incorporate them into the scarf's pattern so subtly that you had to look closely to notice. But once you saw them, you couldn't unsee them. The note this time was longer, more unhinged. Every thread connects us now. Every breath you take breathes me in. Family forever. My mother-in-law's reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. Sunday dinner that week was supposed to be a celebration of my nephew's acceptance to college, but it turned into a battlefield when my mother-in-law arrived carrying a plastic bag full of altered gifts and accusations. "Look at what you've been sending me," she screamed at Sarah before anyone had even finished saying grace. "Look at these sick, twisted things." Sarah stared at the items spread across the dining room table, her face cycling through confusion, horror, and genuine fear. "I didn't send these. I don't know what these are. Don't lie to me. It's your handwriting. Your hair. Your sick way of trying to get into my head." The entire family watched in stunned silence as my mother-in-law ranted about psychological warfare and mind games, waving the modified scarf like evidence in a trial. Sarah's protests of innocence only seemed to fuel her conviction that she was being gaslit by someone she trusted. "You want my money so badly that you're trying to drive me insane," my mother-in-law continued, her voice reaching a pitch that made the children start crying. "You think if you scare me enough I'll just hand everything over. I don't know what you're talking about." Sarah shot back, tears streaming down her face. "I gave you those gifts because I love you. I would never do something like this." My husband finally found his voice, placing a hand on his mother's arm. "Mom, maybe you should sit down. Take a breath." She shook him off violently. "Don't you see what she's doing? She's trying to make me look crazy so you'll all side with her." I watched it all unfold from my seat at the far end of the table, occasionally offering concerned looks and gentle murmurs about how stress can make people see things differently. When Jennifer asked if I thought they should call someone, a doctor, a therapist, anyone, I suggested that maybe everyone just needed some space to process what was happening. The dinner ended with Sarah storming out, my mother-in-law barricading herself in the guest bathroom, and the rest of the family standing around looking like survivors of a natural disaster. Later, as we drove home in silence, my husband finally spoke. "Do you think Mom is losing it?" I reached over and squeezed his hand sympathetically. "I think she's under a lot of pressure lately. The lawsuit, the family tensions. Maybe she just needs professional help." He nodded slowly, probably already planning conversations with his siblings about intervention and elder care. I smiled in the darkness, knowing that the foundation of their relationship was cracked beyond repair. The conversations about my mother-in-law's mental health started that Monday morning, whispered phone calls between siblings who were finally admitting what they'd all been thinking. Jennifer called me first, her voice heavy with exhaustion and concern. "David thinks we should look into assisted living facilities," she said without preamble. "Not immediately, but maybe start researching options. Last night it was really bad." I made appropriate sounds of sympathy while mentally calculating my next move. The family was fracturing exactly as I'd planned, but I needed one final push to ensure my mother-in-law's complete isolation. Something decisive that would eliminate any possibility of her recovering her standing in their eyes. What kind of timeline are you thinking? I asked, injecting just the right amount of reluctant practicality into my voice. I don't know. She won't talk to any of us. She's convinced we're all conspiring against her with Sarah, which is insane because Sarah hasn't spoken to any of us since Sunday. Perfect. The paranoia was spreading faster than I'd anticipated. That afternoon, I sat in my car outside Marcus's office for 20 minutes before finally going inside. What I was about to do crossed a line I'd never imagined approaching, but my mother-in-law had forced this escalation when she chose to humiliate me publicly at Christmas dinner. I need something that looks like a debt collection notice, I told him, sliding a manila folder across his desk. Official letterhead, legal language, the works. Marcus examined my rough draft. A document claiming Sarah had loaned my mother-in-law $180,000 over the past 2 years, with interest and penalties bringing the total to nearly $200,000. The language was deliberately vague about the nature of the loans, suggesting everything from gambling debts to secret business investments. This is getting into fraud territory, Marcus warned, his fingers drumming nervously on his desk. Fake debt collection notices can trigger federal investigations. It's not fraud if it never gets filed with any official agency, I replied calmly. It's just a piece of paper designed to scare someone who's already paranoid. He quoted me a price that was triple his usual fee, clearly hoping I'd back down. Instead, I counted out cash from my emergency fund, money I'd been secretly saving for exactly this kind of situation. The document he produced 3 days later was a masterpiece of intimidation. Official-looking letterhead for Midwest Recovery Solutions, complete with case numbers and legal references that would check out if anyone bothered to verify them. The language was threatening without being overtly illegal, demanding immediate payment and threatening further collection actions if the debt wasn't resolved within 10 days. But the document was only half the plan. The other half required a different kind of contact, one that Marcus was reluctant to provide even after I'd paid him. These guys don't work for people like you, he said, scribbling a phone number on the back of a business card. They usually deal with actual debt collection, repo work, that kind of thing. They're not actors. I just need them to knock on a door and hand over some paperwork, I said. Nothing violent, nothing illegal. Just intimidation. The man who answered when I called had a voice like gravel in a cement mixer. He listened to my request without interruption, quoted me a price that made Marcus's fees look reasonable, and agreed to visit my mother-in-law's house the following Tuesday. We knock, we deliver the papers, we leave, he said. If she doesn't answer, we tape it to the door and go. That's it. That's all I need, I assured him, though some part of me wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. Tuesday afternoon found me parked 3 houses down from my mother-in-law's, ostensibly reading a book while actually watching for the arrival of my hired intimidators. I'd planned to simply drive by afterward and observe her reaction to finding the notice, but curiosity got the better of me. The 2 men who showed up looked exactly like what central casting would order for threatening debt collectors. One tall and thin, one broad and stocky, both wearing dark suits that had seen better days. They walked up to her front door with the confident stride of people accustomed to delivering bad news. I watched them knock. Wait. Knock again, louder this time. My mother-in-law's car was in the driveway, so I knew she was home. But after the past few weeks of mysterious packages and family drama, she'd apparently decided that answering the door was no longer safe. The men waited for exactly 3 minutes, I timed it, before the shorter one produced what looked like a lock-pick set from his jacket pocket. That wasn't part of the plan. I watched in growing horror as they actually opened her front door and disappeared inside the house. This was supposed to be simple intimidation, not breaking and entering. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, unsure whether to call the police or my own attorney. The sounds reached me even through my closed car windows. Crashes, shouting, the unmistakable noise of furniture being overturned. Whatever they were doing in there had escalated far beyond delivering paperwork. When my mother-in-law's front door burst open 15 minutes later, she stumbled out wearing only her nightgown, her hair wild and her voice raised in a scream that carried across the entire neighborhood. Help me. Someone help me. They're destroying everything. The 2 men emerged calmly behind her, walking to their car as if nothing unusual had happened. They drove away before the first neighbor appeared on their porch to investigate the commotion. I sat frozen in my car, watching as my mother-in-law collapsed on her front lawn, sobbing and gesturing wildly at her house. Mrs. Patterson from next door was the first to reach her, wrapping a bathrobe around her shoulders and pulling out her phone to call for help. When the police arrived, my mother-in-law was nearly incoherent. Between gasps and tears, she tried to explain about debt collectors and legal documents and people trying to frame her, but the story sounded like the ravings of someone having a complete mental breakdown. Officer Martinez was among the responding officers, and I could see him exchanging meaningful looks with his partner as my mother-in-law rambled about family conspiracies and fake inheritances. "Ma'am, you mentioned debt collectors," Officer Martinez said patiently. "Do you have any documentation about debts you owe?" That's when my mother-in-law realized her trap. She couldn't produce the fake debt notice without explaining the fake inheritance lawsuit. She couldn't explain why legitimate debt collectors would break into her house without admitting that maybe they weren't legitimate. Every answer led to questions she couldn't answer without revealing the web of lies I'd helped create around her. "It's all connected," she kept saying, her voice rising with frustration. "The packages, the lawsuit, the money. Someone is trying to drive me crazy and nobody believes me." The irony was that she was absolutely right, but she'd spent so many weeks appearing paranoid and unstable that the truth sounded like delusion. I watched the police take their report, saw them examining the damage inside her house through the open front door. Someone had indeed carved "thief" into her antique dining table, along with several other words I couldn't make out from my distance. Her living room looked like a hurricane had passed through it. When Jennifer's car pulled up an hour later, I finally drove away. I'd seen enough to know that my mother-in-law's credibility was permanently destroyed. Whatever story she told about debt collectors and break-ins would be filtered through her family's growing conviction that she was losing her mind. That night, I lay in bed listening to my husband's side of the phone conversation with his sister, their voices heavy with the weight of decisions no adult child wants to make. "We can't keep pretending this is normal," he said. "She needs professional help and she needs it now." I closed my eyes and smiled in the darkness, finally feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: complete and total vindication. The satisfaction I felt watching my husband hang up the phone lasted exactly 12 hours before reality set in. I had crossed lines I couldn't uncross, done things that would horrify the woman I used to be. But as I sat in my kitchen the next morning, drinking coffee and scrolling through Sarah's increasingly desperate social media posts, I realized I wasn't done yet. Her Instagram story from Tuesday night showed a hastily packed suitcase and a caption that read, "Sometimes you have to know when to cut your losses. New city, new life, new beginning. #fresh start, #toxic free, #movingin." Within an hour, I'd called the airline's customer service line, pretending to be her concerned friend who needed to know her flight details to pick her up at her destination. The script I'd prepared was convincing: worried friend, family emergency, urgent contact needed. The customer service representative was sympathetic enough to confirm that Sarah Chin had a reservation on Flight 447 to Phoenix, departing Thursday at 2:15 p.m. Phoenix made sense. Her sister lived there, the one who'd been sending occasional supportive comments on Sarah's posts throughout this entire ordeal. Sarah was running home to regroup, probably planning to reinvent herself somewhere nobody knew about the inheritance lawsuit or the debt collection drama. But I couldn't let her leave with a clean slate, not after everything she'd put me through. The ring on her finger, my ring, was just the beginning of what she'd taken from me. She'd stolen my place in the family, my husband's attention, my mother-in-law's affection. She deserved to understand what public humiliation felt like, what it was like to have strangers stare and whisper and judge. That evening, I drove to Marcus's office one final time. The strip mall was nearly empty at 7 p.m., just the nail salon still open with one customer getting a late pedicure. "I need one more favor," I told him, placing the remaining altered jewelry box on his desk. This was the piece de resistance, a small Tiffany box that originally contained earrings, now modified with his signature touch. The foul smell emanating from it was somehow worse than the others, sweet and cloying like flowers left too long in water. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Marcus asked, clearly uncomfortable with how far our arrangement had evolved. "Nothing. I just need to borrow it for a few hours tomorrow." He stared at me for a long moment, probably seeing something in my expression that made him nervous. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm starting to think." "You're starting to think what?" I interrupted, my voice sharper than I'd intended. That maybe you shouldn't have taken cash payments for creating fake evidence? That maybe you should have asked more questions about why someone needed replica designer goods that smelled like death. His mouth shut with an audible click. We both knew he was too deep in this to start developing a conscience now. Thursday morning I dressed carefully, business casual, nothing memorable, the kind of outfit that would blend into any airport crowd. I arrived at the departure terminal 2 hours before Sarah's flight, giving myself plenty of time to observe her check-in routine and identify the perfect moment for my final act. She looked terrible. Even from across the departure hall, I could see the stress lines around her eyes, the way she kept checking her phone for messages that probably weren't coming. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt that suggested she'd slept in it. Emma wasn't with her, which meant she'd either left her daughter with relatives or, more likely, couldn't afford to bring her along on this escape attempt. That detail bothered me more than it should have. Whatever else Sarah had done, Emma was innocent in all this. I watched Sarah struggle with her oversized suitcase at the check-in kiosk, clearly flustered by the weight restrictions and additional fees. When she stepped away to reorganize her belongings, I made my move. The departures area was crowded enough that nobody paid attention to one middle-aged woman briefly approaching an unattended suitcase. The jewelry box slipped into the outer pocket of her carry-on bag like it belonged there, nestled between what looked like phone chargers and travel documents. Then I found a seat in the departure lounge cafe, ordered a latte I didn't want, and opened a magazine I couldn't focus on. The wait was excruciating. Sarah made it through the initial security checkpoint without incident, and for a moment I wondered if my plan had failed. Maybe they wouldn't search her bag. Maybe the smell wasn't strong enough to trigger suspicion. Maybe I'd spent weeks orchestrating this elaborate revenge only to watch her fly away untouched. But then I saw the TSA agent wrinkle his nose as Sarah's bag went through the scanner. "Ma'am, we need to do a secondary screening of your carry-on," he announced, pulling her bag aside. Sarah's confusion was genuine. She had no idea what they might find. I watched her face cycle through puzzlement, then concern, then dawning horror as the agent opened the outer pocket and the smell hit him full force. "What is this?" he demanded, holding the jewelry box at arm's length. I don't know," Sarah stammered. "I've never seen that before in my life." The lie was technically true, but it sounded exactly like what someone would say if they'd been caught smuggling something illegal. Within minutes, additional security personnel had arrived, and Sarah was being escorted to a private screening room. I couldn't hear the conversation from my position in the cafe, but I could see Sarah's increasingly frantic gestures through the glass partition. She was trying to explain something, probably the inheritance lawsuit, the debt collection incident, the recent family drama. But the more she talked, the more suspicious she appeared. Airport security doesn't care about family feuds or civil lawsuits. They care about potential threats to aviation security, and a woman traveling with mysteriously altered items that reeked of decay fit their profile of someone worth investigating thoroughly. When they missed her boarding call by 40 minutes, I knew my plan had succeeded. The questioning lasted for hours. I ordered another coffee, bought a newspaper, and settled in to watch the aftermath unfold. Sarah's social media updates began around hour 3. Increasingly desperate posts about being detained for no reason, and framed by people who want to destroy my life. Her friends' responses were initially supportive, but as the details of her situation became clearer, the tone shifted. Questions about why someone would be carrying suspicious items at an airport. Speculation about what kind of family drama could escalate to this level. Gradual distancing from someone whose problems were clearly more complicated than a simple custody dispute or inheritance disagreement. By the time security finally released her 12 hours later, Sarah's reputation was as damaged as my mother-in-law's. Her missed flight had cost her money she couldn't afford to lose. Her social media presence was flooded with questions she couldn't answer without sounding paranoid or delusional. Most importantly, she now understood exactly what I'd felt sitting at that Christmas dinner table. The humiliation of being powerless while people around you made decisions about your life. The frustration of knowing the truth but being unable to make anyone believe it. As I finally left the airport that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. Perfect, complete justice. Not the legal kind that takes years and costs fortunes, but the immediate personal kind that comes from watching someone reap exactly what they've sown. Sarah would eventually make it to Phoenix, But she'd arrive carrying baggage that had nothing to do with airlines and everything to do with the choices she'd made when she decided to steal someone else's life. The drive home from the airport took me through the old neighborhood where I'd grown up, past the elementary school where I'd learned that fairness was something you had to fight for, not something that was handed to you. I parked outside my childhood home for 20 minutes, watching a different family live in the space where I'd once believed the world was fundamentally just. That little girl who'd cried when other kids cut in line or took her lunch money would barely recognize the woman I'd become. But she'd be proud of me. 3 weeks later, my husband appeared on my doorstep with grocery store flowers and the kind of wounded expression he'd perfected during our marriage whenever he needed forgiveness for something he couldn't quite bring himself to acknowledge. He'd waited, I realized, for the worst of the storm to pass. Sarah was gone, his mother was in therapy, and the family had collectively decided to pretend the entire inheritance fiasco had been a misunderstanding caused by stress and grief. "Can I come in?" he asked, shifting the bouquet from one hand to the other like he wasn't sure what to do with it. I stepped aside and let him enter, noting how he paused in the entryway to take in the changes I'd made to my house. The family photos were gone from the mantel, replaced with art I'd chosen myself. The furniture had been rearranged to create conversation areas that felt more like a sanctuary than a showplace. Everything about the space now reflected my taste rather than the compromise aesthetic that had defined our marriage. "The place looks good," he said carefully. "Different but good." I waited for him to continue, offering neither encouragement nor resistance. He'd come here with a speech prepared, probably rehearsed in his car during the drive over, and I was curious to hear how he planned to rewrite our history. "I know I messed up," he began, settling into the chair that used to be his favorite. "I should have defended you better. I should have seen what my mother was doing and put a stop to it." I replied non-committally, taking a seat across from him rather than beside him. "The thing is, I never wanted any of this to happen. The ring, Sarah, all the family drama. I got caught in the middle and didn't know how to handle it." He was trying to position himself as another victim of his mother's manipulation, I realized. In his version of events, we'd both been pawns in her game rather than him being a willing participant in my systematic erasure from the family. "I've been thinking about us a lot lately," he continued, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "About what we had before everything got so complicated. The new engagement ring was larger than my original, more expensive, probably chosen to demonstrate the sincerity of his apology through carat weight. He set it on the coffee table between us like an offering. "I want to try again," he said. "If you'll have me." I stared at the ring for a long moment, letting him marinate in the silence. This was the moment he'd been building toward, the grand gesture that was supposed to sweep away months of betrayal and neglect. He was counting on my capacity for forgiveness, banking on the idea that I was still the woman who'd absorbed years of small humiliations in the name of keeping peace. "That's beautiful," I said finally. "She must have expensive taste." His face went through several expressions before settling on confusion. "She? Your mother? I assume she picked this one out too, the way she picked out Sarah's Christmas present." The color drained from his cheeks. "I chose this myself. Mom had nothing to do with it." "Did you though?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Or did you choose it the way you chose to give her my original ring for safekeeping? The way you chose to stay silent while she erased me from your family photos? The way you chose to let Sarah take my seat at dinner tables for months?" He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. We both knew the truth. His choices had always been about avoiding conflict with his mother, never about protecting me. "I can't undo what happened," he said finally. "But I can promise it won't happen again." I picked up the ring box and examined it more closely. The diamond was beautiful, flawless, the kind of stone that would make other women envious at social gatherings. Everything a proper engagement ring should be. "The problem with promises," I said, closing the box with a soft click, "is that they require trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't just magically repair itself because someone brings flowers and jewelry." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd been redesigning since the divorce papers were filed. My lawyer had been surprised when I'd insisted on keeping the house. It was more than I could easily afford alone, but I'd needed something that was entirely mine, a space where nobody else's opinions or preferences held any weight. "So what are you saying?" he asked, his voice smaller now. "I'm saying I'll think about it." And I did think about it for exactly the length of time it took him to drive away. Then I called my therapist and scheduled an extra session for the following week. Dr. Morrison had been the first person to suggest that maybe my marriage problems weren't actually about communication or compromise. Some people drain energy from others, she'd said during our third session. They take and take until you don't recognize yourself anymore. The question isn't whether you can fix the relationship, it's whether you want to go back to being the person you were in it. I didn't. My husband kept calling after that, leaving voicemails that started apologetic and gradually became more demanding. Why wasn't I answering? When would I give him a real answer? Didn't he deserve better than this silent treatment after everything he'd been through with his family? The entitlement in that last message made me laugh out loud. Everything he'd been through. As if he'd been the victim of his mother's schemes rather than their beneficiary. I changed my phone number the following week. The job offer from the marketing firm in Denver came at exactly the right time. A friend from college had recommended me for the position, and the salary was enough to justify leaving everything familiar behind. When I called to accept, the HR manager seemed pleased by my enthusiasm for starting fresh in a new environment. If only she knew. My mother-in-law's world was shrinking in ways that must have terrified her. Jennifer told me during one of our increasingly rare conversations that their mother was seeing a psychiatrist twice a week and taking medication for anxiety. The inheritance lawsuit had cost her nearly $40,000 in legal fees, money she couldn't afford to lose on her fixed income. She keeps talking about being framed, Jennifer said wearily. The therapist thinks it's a form of paranoid thinking brought on by stress and isolation. That must be difficult for all of you, I replied, injecting just the right amount of sympathy into my voice. The worst part is we can't have normal family gatherings anymore. She gets suspicious if too many people are there, like we're plotting against her. Last Sunday she accused David of recording her conversation with his phone. The family I'd once desperately wanted to belong to was fragmenting exactly as I'd planned, each member retreating into their own protective shells rather than dealing with the toxic dynamics that had always existed beneath the surface of their holiday smiles. Are you still planning to come to Christmas dinner? Jennifer asked hesitantly. I paused, considering. The invitation wasn't extended out of love or genuine desire for my company. It was guilt and social obligation, the same forces that had kept me trapped in their orbit for years. But now I had a choice. I'll try to make it, I said, already knowing I'd cancel at the last minute. Though I might have to work that weekend. The lie came so easily now, smooth as silk and twice as comfortable. That evening, I tried on my original engagement ring for the first time since it had been returned through Sarah's legal proceedings. It fit perfectly the way it always had, but it felt different on my finger. Heavier. Not with sentiment but with the weight of everything I'd learned about myself in the process of getting it back. I wasn't the same woman who'd worn it innocently for 4 years, believing that love and goodness would eventually triumph over selfishness and manipulation. I was someone harder now, more calculating, less willing to absorb other people's cruelty in the name of keeping peace. Some people might call that damaged. I called it educated. Christmas morning in Denver was different. Snow fell in fat, lazy flakes outside my new apartment window, and for the first time in years, I woke up without checking my phone for family drama or obligatory holiday messages. The silence was perfect. Jennifer had called 3 times the night before, each voicemail more desperate than the last. Please come. She keeps asking if you're coming. I think she needs to see you. My mother-in-law was dying. Not dramatically, not from anything I'd caused, but quietly succumbing to the stress-related heart condition that had worsened since her world collapsed. The doctor said she had weeks, maybe a month. I booked a flight that afternoon. The family gathered at Jennifer's house looked like survivors of a natural disaster. My husband sat alone in a corner, the rejected engagement ring probably still sitting in his sock drawer. David avoided eye contact, embarrassed by his mother's public breakdown months earlier. The grandchildren played quietly, sensing the adults' discomfort. And there she was, my mother-in-law, shrunken in a wheelchair by the window. The woman who'd once commanded every room she entered now looked frail and uncertain, her eyes darting nervously whenever someone approached. She saw me before anyone else did. You came, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I walked over and knelt beside her wheelchair, close enough that only she could hear me. Of course I came. We're family, remember? Her eyes searched my face, looking for something, forgiveness, perhaps, or acknowledgement of what she'd put me through. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out a small wrapped box. "I brought you something," I said, placing it in her trembling hands. She unwrapped it slowly, her fingers struggling with the paper. Inside was a jewelry box, not one of Marcus's altered pieces, but a simple, elegant container holding my original engagement ring. "I thought you should have this back," I said quietly, "since you seem to think it belonged to your family." She stared at the ring, her breath coming in short gasps. "I don't understand." "Yes, you do." I leaned closer, my voice barely a whisper. "You taught me something important about family loyalty. About how people show their true nature when they think no one is watching. About how power works in families like yours." Her eyes widened as understanding dawned. Not the paranoid delusions she'd been grappling with for months, but crystal-clear comprehension of exactly who had orchestrated her downfall. "It was you," she breathed. "Merry Christmas," I replied, standing up and smoothing my dress. I stayed for dinner, making pleasant conversation about my new job and apartment. When people asked about my plans, I spoke enthusiastically about starting over, about how liberating it felt to build a life based on my own choices rather than other people's expectations. As I prepared to leave, my mother-in-law caught my arm with surprising strength. "Why?" she asked. I looked down at her, this woman who'd spent years trying to erase me from her son's life, and felt something I'd never expected: pity. "Because you forgot something important," I said gently. "When you push someone hard enough, eventually they stop pulling themselves back up. They learn to push back instead." I walked out of that house for the last time, leaving behind a family that had never truly been mine. In my car, I finally allowed myself to cry, not for what I'd lost but for what I'd found. 3 weeks later, Jennifer called to tell me my mother-in-law had passed peacefully in her sleep. I sent flowers and a sympathy card, but I didn't attend the funeral. Some chapters once closed should stay that way. I never saw any of them again. If this story of calculated revenge had you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when she handed back that engagement ring, watching her mother-in-law finally realize who destroyed her world. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.